Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar and digital book discussion by the Swedish Institute of International Affairs on Kristina Simion's newly published Rule of Law Intermediaries, Brokering Influence in Myanmar. This book zooms in on intermediaries' crucial importance in establishing trust and translating rule of law to the national context of Myanmar. My name is Stina Eriksson, and I am Program Manager and Analyst at the Asia program here at UI, and I'll be moderating this session today. And before I introduce our guests today, or our speakers today, I would like to encourage all our viewers to submit your questions through the Q&A function here on Zoom. And if you're joining us at the live stream on Facebook, you can leave your comments there, and we'll also make sure to bring up these questions during this session we have together today. So we are very happy and honored to have today's speakers with us. I would like to firstly warmly welcome my colleague and UI research fellow, Kristina Simion, who will be presenting the findings of her book. Kristina is also a visiting fellow at the Department of Political and Social Change at Australia National University, College of Asia and Pacific, and her research focuses on rule of law development assistance and Myanmar. I also want to welcome our two discussants today, Dr. Jonathan Liljeblad and Dr. Imelda de Inla, all the way from Canberra, Australia, both of them today. Jonathan is a senior lecturer at College of Law at Australia National University, and Imelda is an associate professor at Ateneo School of Government at Ateneo Manila University in the Philippines. So I'd be happy to hear more about the two of you from yourselves. So Imelda, please present yourself.
Good afternoon, Stina. Thank you for the warm introduction. And of course, very privileged to be part of this very important book launching. Thank you, Christina, for the invitation. I am Imelda de Inla. So I was previously working at the Australia National University before, and that's why I was former colleagues with Christina. But now I work from home. I'm based here in Canberra, but I work at the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. So I work on the intersection between law and politics, definitely rule of law. My work has been on ASEAN integration. I've done judicial politics, writing also gender and judicial independence, as well as on conflict, justice, and security in the context of Mindanao in the Philippines.
Thank you, Imelda. And Jonathan?
Yes, hello. It's nice to meet everyone today. So, Yabori Taunji Myanmar men jag växte upp I Malmö. Så jag pratar lilla svenska, men idag vi måste prata engelska. Ja? Så, men tack så mycket på inbjudan. So thank you so much for the invitation today. Just for everyone who's speaking English, I was born in Taunji in Myanmar, but I grew up in Malmö. And then also lived for quite some time in the United States and currently work in Australia. A lot of my research is focused primarily on rule of law issues using empirical work with case studies from human rights and environmental law. And my focus is primarily in developing countries, particularly with promoting international norms in places like Myanmar, which are trying to transition or were transitioning from an authoritarian system to something different, although since the coup, things have gone into reverse. But I was inadvertently one of the examples of an intermediary that Christina was studying. And so I had some feedback and comments and thoughts on a very impressive work, but thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And now, Christina, we're very excited and looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, Stina, and thanks for organizing this book event. And thanks also to our guests for attending and for providing comments on this presentation. So as has been mentioned, my book is really about, the people that make development happen. So it's about those people that play an important function as mediators, brokers, translators in between development counterparts in the rule of law assistance field, especially. And I ask how they influence the field. So I look at their agency and the influence they play in forming and shaping the way development is both delivered and the way development happens in difficult settings. And we'll remain for a while focusing on the front cover of my book that brings back a lot of memories to me. So here I am traveling with a group of key intermediaries who often traveled around the country in Myanmar to provide trainings on rule of law. Here we are at the beach in Rakhine State in Sittwe, and I managed to capture one of the intermediaries I spent a lot of time with as he's standing in between, two other people. One is me and another colleague in these shadows. And I think, everything about him, the posture and his clothing, he's wearing a traditional lungi, but a more business-like shirt and a more modern type of bag sort of represents the way he was standing with one foot in each camp. So he was able to speak fluently in English with foreign donors, and he also had connections at local levels because of his previous engagements in local politics as a representative of the National League for Democracy. So he had been a political activist, he had been educated abroad. He talked about how he was picked up by a donor when they saw him speaking at a conference just when transition happened. So they picked him up, that's his own words, because they saw him as a person that could help them in their work with spreading these ideas of rule of law across the country. But he was also he had very ambivalent feelings about his work. He often said that he had to get out of this business because people on the local side did not trust foreigners and their intentions. And he wanted to remain in politics, which also made it difficult for him to be perceived as being too close to the foreigners as a distrusted person. He had just managed to gain a seat in local elections in 2020 with the National League for Democracy, and his whole Facebook page was filled with pictures of him as a politician. And then, a day after the coup, his page was stripped of all these pictures, and he had to go into hiding again. So that was quite sad to see how this sort of young, ambitious person's whole life trajectory was all of a sudden just brought to a halt again. So I really ask, how intermediaries broker influence and why they matter, why they're important. And the way, and my findings, what they show is that when we unlock the perspectives of intermediaries, we see that, development models have weak ways of being contextualized. We also see that when you have a shallow understanding of the context, that leads to development actors from abroad taking wrong ways and terms. And foreign actors often look for things as they are at home. And we also see that development assistance is much influenced by who gets to be included and why. And my book is based on 8 years of research and work related to Myanmar. I focus on rule of law as a development field that emerged with the influence of international actors after political transition in 2011. And the foreigners who arrived then, they were aware of the authoritarian context, but not the full picture at all. And while they were able to discuss things like rule of law and governance, resistance was really showed when they tried to move into activities which were stalled or took other turns and didn't lead to any sort of substantial change in the end. We also saw from this period that rule of law was a concept with really different meanings in the local context as opposed to what was being introduced by foreign actors. But in this whole confusion that I would describe it as with different actors emerging, one new for each day, and these intermediaries trying to sort out really what was going on. Intermediaries emerged to enable access to counterparts, to build relationships, to broker trust and mediate understandings and conflicts, and also translate these concepts that had no local counterpart or no meaning in the local context. And if we look at their profiles, intermediaries, they were Myanmar lawyers, NGO leaders, local staff, government employees, and then some foreign consultants. And the way I found these individuals, that I would go to sort of the identified foreign donors who were there at the time and ask them, who is the key person that helps you reach out to the other side? And they would describe these individuals as, a peacemaker, someone who opens doors, someone with one foot in and one foot out, the one with all the connections, the link, the point of contact, the one at the interface. So I wouldn't use, a predetermined analytical tool to determine who was an intermediary or not, because I wanted to really find out who played this function in their own rights. I would then seek the intermediaries, but not through their employers, so I could gain trust and spend a lot of time with them to do more ethnographic work. And they would also describe what they did in these terms. They said, I'm a bridge, I'm a fixer, I'm the in-between, the diplomatic interferer, coordinator, aligner of capital, facilitator, translator. So if we look at how they broker influence, as I mentioned, they were key to enable access to counterparts, which also meant a lot of relationship building. And this quote is from one of the foreign program manager who had spent, substantial time in Myanmar, but still, he said, Burma is a new market. How do we do it? It's incredibly difficult to get in. So we had a lot of people in the country who had they didn't speak the local or any of the local languages. Many of them had not been to the country before because it had been so isolated. And they also had difficulties understanding local cultures, but still they were there and they were expected to perform based on their mission in the country. So what they did then, they employed intermediaries, and they were the ones who got to select who is included in rule of law development. They were the ones who provided these internationals with local voice because they had no means of checking the message that were being communicated. And this then led to complete reliance on intermediaries. I even met program managers who steered, the whole direction of their projects based on the wishes of their intermediaries. And other effects of this complete reliance on intermediaries was that when we saw that there was a high demand on, English-speaking, well-educated, cosmopolitan individuals who wanted to work for foreign donors, but there was a very limited supply of suitable intermediaries from the perspective of the donors. And one effect of that was the donors would create coalitions and invest in NGOs to serve as intermediaries. But the effect of that then is that you mimic the local ownership, and some of these organizations today have been dissolved because they didn't gain the trust that was needed in the local setting. They were always perceived as being a foreign construct, something that was being constructed by foreigners. Also, donors prioritized intermediaries with likable personalities who are easy to work with and who are not connected, at least obviously connected to the military, or who do not share the same ideas of human rights as the foreign donors did. So the issue and the problems with that is that individuals with local influence and qualification can easily be overlooked. For example, those who did not possess a good level of English. And of course, that can lead to resentment and anger by those bypassed, especially the older generation who has spent decades in the political struggle towards democracy. But also, one effect was that donors would work with the same group of intermediaries who would move between donors and assignments. And the space for sort of how development happens in that case is that it becomes very narrow. You come in with a lot of money and projects, and everything is channeled through a couple of individuals. And they also broker influence as trust builders. And in Myanmar, especially, foreign interests were distrusted. And this is a quote from a local intermediary who says that they don't, and he's talking about national and local counterparts, they don't trust foreign funded organizations, and they don't like it. They don't think any foreign organizations do it only because of goodwill. Another reason for this distrust was that foreign actors were often unapproachable. So they were staying in Yangon, in the economic capital. They had harder times relocating to regional areas or local areas or the capital, Naypyidaw, which also made relationship building a lot more difficult. And also, as is common within the field, foreigners would use contract instead of trust, which created a lot of difficulties with local counterparts. And I'll let you read this other quote from a foreign program manager. So in this sort of setting of distrust, it is intermediaries that become the trusted link. But again, they're in a very ambivalent position, as I mentioned, with the intermediary on my cover image. And they really play up their commitment to the funders while then playing down their global connections in local settings where foreign connections are distrusted. And working for foreigners also makes them more distrusted and puts them at more risk. And this, at the local level, I saw that this often led to something I term reputational laundering. So intermediaries would take the project idea or package that was being introduced by a foreign organization and rebrand it or present it as their own project. And this would often lead to criticism from the foreign employers that were upset because their branding was not on the course package or the material being delivered. And that is quite interesting how focused we are on the branding, because for successful vernacularization of these ideas, this is a necessary step that we take the ideas and localize them. And if you look at the concept of rule of law, here also intermediaries brokered a lot of influence as translators, and a lot more influence than we would normally perceive a translator as having. They would reframe rule of law, so they would steer away from a language brought in by foreign promoters that was often misunderstood by their counterparts. And they were expected to translate these concepts in an objective manner, and their foreign employers would often be upset with them when they were sort of putting their own values into translations, while they saw that that was necessary. As one local intermediary said, I use many language tricks. It's good to put your own values into the translation. But what this really shows then, when we look at the work of intermediaries, is that rule of law in this setting was, an issue that resists change. It really illustrates the mismatch between understandings, and that the concept that was brought in was quite uneasy as understood by the other side. By focusing on intermediaries, we also see how difficult this concept was to vernacularize in this setting. So if we move to conclusions, and I think the key message from this book is that intermediaries are central for making development happen. So they're not just people we should take for granted, as the fixer or that person who is in the field. They really embody the development architecture. They are, in fact, the real experts. And if we would spend more time listening to what they have to say and gain their trust, that would reveal a lot of insights into what goes wrong. It also shows us the power balances at play. We bring in foreign experts, as we call them, and then we have these individuals who are just expected to be there and help us perform the job. So they're really key to understanding the mismatch between donors' ideas and local realities. For example, the way we look for a Weber-style state versus the relational state that we might find in place. So I think that we should really also explore more in depth the relational aspects of these people and how they perform specific functions within their own right as embodying the relational state, rather than just thinking about them as someone whose networks we can use and someone in between. And also we need to recognize that their work is not neutral. So allegiance with foreigners puts them at risk. And this is also problematic when development funding is quickly withdrawn, which leaves them without an income and also even more vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina, for this very interesting presentation and such a thorough work. It's just so interesting to hear like how you mix it in with all the quotes and so on. So I really enjoyed it. I have a question that you kind of touched upon now by the end in your conclusion, where intermediaries, as you explained, are usually seen mostly as a bridge or like the translator, so on. It feels like intermediaries come in maybe like a step or two too late. Should we use intermediaries and their expertise more like in conceptualization of projects or development assistance? Should it be used more in the program design stage, since they obviously have like expertise and knowledge that's invaluable to foreign donors?
Good. So the easy answer is absolutely. At least we should use more sort of robust country knowledge, which they embody. And I mean, they are also the people that foreign donors would meet if they go on, a quicker fact-finding mission. But I'm not sure they would be able to, get a sense of the whole picture during a short trip like that. So one of the intermediaries, for example, that I spent a lot of time with, he was really that person that foreigners came to see when they were in town, and he was attending meetings for an hour with everyone and everybody. I'm not sure he would then provide all these difficulties. He would probably give them the stage story of how the country needs democracy and rule of law. So the real insights, that took me weeks or months of relationship building to be able to get, and I was able to get those insights also as I was not perceived as a donor. I was an outsider, so I wasn't the employer. And I often found that the intermediary view and the employer view would be completely different, but they did not know I was speaking to the other side, but they would tell me completely different things. And the foreign side was often thinking that they were aligned with the intermediary and that the intermediary revealed everything of importance and that they were working on the same page. But that was really not the impression I got from my conversations with intermediaries. But so we should definitely use people like this or thinking around these questions in conceptualization and the design of projects. But the difficult question is how do we do it? How do we incorporate knowledge like this in that design stage? And that's a bigger question. Maybe Jonathan has something to add on that.
Thank you, Christina. I think we're getting questions, which is great, but I think we're going to move on to Imelda and Jonathan's reflections, because and then I'll incorporate the questions from the viewers after that. So Imelda, please.
Thank you again, Christina and Stina, for the invitation to be a reactor for this very relevant work, especially as we see the democratic collapse of Myanmar and Afghanistan These are two countries where the international community heavily invested in rule of law development assistance. Myanmar in particular is a demonstration of the inability of a fragile rule of law to tame the brute force of military power. Of course, we cannot solely attribute Myanmar's democratic collapse to the failure of laws and institutions built precisely to constrain that power, or whether we can say that Myanmar's rule of law project was an utter failure, considering that we see the unceasing courage of ordinary Burmese citizens continuing their struggle to reclaim their rights, freedom, and perhaps the democratic way of life. I'm not an expert on Myanmar, but I can assume that on one hand, the belief in the salience of rule of law made it possible for a new political compact that constrained the Tatmadaw to some extent and allowed the citizens to restore democracy again after decades of military dictatorship. Christina's book gave us a picture of why it was possible in the first place to attempt at building the rule of law in a country long governed by rule by law. And that is because of the people who are invested in varying degrees and motivations or non-motivations or other interests towards a society and government bound by law and not solely governed by powerful men and perhaps some powerful women too. Christina's book allowed us to see the invisible men and women beyond the political elites and personalities that steered and in most cases actually carried the burden of traversing the puzzles and difficulties in rebuilding societies from deep-seated conflicts and violence. And these are men and women who themselves actually experience the adverse effects of violence and conflict. These men and women, the values, ethics, personality, and aspirations they represent are also the manifestation of underlying culture and norms that are often overlooked and less understood by international donors who are more interested in the inputs and outputs, as Christina said in the book. They embody the various ideas of how society itself views the rule of law and how or may not be possible to achieve what the international community wants. As someone who also works in the rule of law space, I can very much relate to what is meant by the role of intermediaries and the role in bringing about the success or failure of any development program. I wear many hats, a scholar, a teacher, but also someone who occasionally go to the field to be part of international development work on justice and security in the Philippines. Despite the parameters that we intermediaries work in, between what the donors expect and what recipients desire, the interlocutors actually bring their own knowledge and skills to the process and are key sources of knowledge and meanings of the rule of law themselves. However, as pointed by Christina, the intermediaries are most often not given the importance that they deserve, and not merely as translators of foreign norms, but as active makers or producers of these norms. So the intermediaries are actually sources and producers of these norms and values. Local knowledge has become a byword in development assistance, but in reality, and you correct me for that, but in reality, international development assistance works in preconceived notions with very little wiggle room for the locals. The very popular theory of change, for instance, though recognizing the context and variety of actors, actually points to set expectations. And that is mostly expectations of international funding institutions. Recognizing the knowledge and skills of the intermediaries beyond their role as translators could perhaps change the way international assistance could be truly owned and shaped by locals. This includes a fuller understanding of what could work in unconventional ways and of respecting their decisions. So I think the respect for that decisions on the ground is quite hard for many of the international development organizations working in this space. And after all, building or rebuilding the rule of law is a function of the whole of society, one that cannot be segregated from the rest and expect deliverables or outputs and outcomes in specific ways. Christina's book is one of those few scholarly books that really presents so much clarity. I really, really love it, as well as many points for reflections on what rule of law looks like in its many complicated facets. Her book tells us that rule of law has no set meaning, We always say, oh, rule of law does not have any one size fits all, but I like it when he says the rule of law has no set meaning, and that perhaps some of its meanings can be found on the people who work on them, the intermediaries who tell their stories and experiences of mediating rule of law in the communities as well as in the levers of power. Lastly, I would like to congratulate Christina in her achievement in publishing a book that is brave as the subjects in the stories, rich in stories and insights from the ground, and written with the future in mind, for the way international development assistance could make a big difference on the ground. I have been privileged to have been part of Christina's journey in completing this impressive book. She actually came to the Philippines while she was doing her fieldwork in Myanmar at the time. A book that provokes us to rethink many of theoretical and policy work on the rule of law and development assistance. So that's all for now, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Melda. Thank you so much. Great reflections. I think we have to move on to Jonathan if we're going to keep the time limit. Jonathan, please.
Yeah, I'll try to keep my comments brief, but just a lot of things to say. I'll just begin by noting that. So I'd mentioned this at the very start that a lot of the work that I was doing was being an intermediary, and it was rather accidental. And the nature of the work that I do, with human rights and environmental conservation in a place like Myanmar, it's better for everyone if my activities are not public. It's the kind of things that we can't discuss, but that's a situation that many intermediaries live in. Particularly in situations that are transitioning out of authoritarian systems, that there is still very much a state of risk for the locals, for activists, and that includes the intermediaries. And so I think with this book and with the research that Christina was doing, I think it played a very critical role in terms of illuminating an area that otherwise people would not be able to speak directly upon. The other thing too is that I think it presented stories, and so much of what happens in life and something that's omitted quite often from scholarship and academic study is very much personal stories, the human dimension to a lot of the things that are occurring. And I think it's very important that as aid workers, as development organizations, as researchers, that we're all have to be aware that there are personal experiences being lived by people. And so that what we work with are not projects, deliverables, or indicators, but very much human lives. So I think that this book was very important for that. From an academic perspective, I'm sure that many people are aware that there's been work on human rights intermediaries, with Sally Mary being the notable prominent figure. But the contribution that comes out of this book and what Christina was doing was connecting that discourse about human rights intermediaries into a discourse about law and development, and very much also about rule of law within that subject. And so it was introducing the notion of intermediaries to a new area and to a new field of work that receives a lot of attention. Now, there was the comment about the many different meanings of rule of law in Myanmar and like why this made it such difficulty. But I can tell you, just speaking from personal experience, that kind of complexity is actually a benefit. In situations like Myanmar, I'm sure it's the same thing in places like Afghanistan, having clarity about certain positions actually can be problematic. Most diplomats will tell you this, that flexibility is always key. You want room to maneuver. And sometimes ambiguity is a good thing because it discourages or it avoids any kind of instinctive rejection or categorical denials coming from figures in the shadows. So in a place like Myanmar, the figures in the shadows were always the military, the Tatmadaw, as well as the various ethnic armed organizations. And you needed to have them stay out of the picture or to at least stay silent in order for aid work to continue. So the way that worked is by maintaining ambiguity and using rule of law and the obscurity of the rule of law as a term, as a very insidious shelter for other operations that are more palatable for Western interests, liberal values in particular regarding human rights. So there's a couple of comments I just want to add to this. And so Christina had, in the presentation, had mentioned things like access, trust, the process of translation. I'll want to add, just to help everyone understand sort of the complexities of these three factors for intermediaries, is that so often what happens as an intermediary is that you're trying to balance the outside with what's happening inside. And that this balance involves subjectivities. And so when we say that you're balancing subjectivities, it means you're ultimately balancing biases, and it's ultimately unconscious biases. So examples of this, there's an affinity bias. So aid workers, aid organizations, donors, they have an affinity for certain kinds of actors. They want to see certain kinds of locals. There are people that they think they can work with. But this invariably means that aid organizations and donors are selectively picking out locals that have a certain kind of a charisma, right? That they have the right look, they have the right language, they have the right behavior. And while that's, that's perfectly understandable, it does constitute an affinity bias. Likewise with locals, they have an affinity for someone who is like them, who looks like them, talks like them, acts like them. But then most critically, and this is my experience, is that they want someone who listens, right? So it's not charisma in terms of how you talk, it's charisma in terms of how you listen. The other form of unconscious bias that comes up quite often is confirmation bias. A lot of aid programs have an agenda, they have deliverables, they have indicators, in which means that they're ultimately looking for things that confirm the objectives, the goals, the agenda of the aid program. The locals, in contrast, they want more pragmatism. They want things to be able to be adjusted to what they think are the local issues, the local concerns. But in either situation, you see that there's an attempt to confirm pre-existing interests or concerns. So with the aid side, it's a confirmation bias towards the aid agenda. From the local side, it's a confirmation bias towards pragmatic or local concerns. Third form of unconscious bias is groupthink. And so this is an issue of like trying to maintain the hierarchy that exists in decision-making. So with the donors and aid organizations, there is very much a hierarchy in terms of how decisions are made. And ultimately decisions have to be approved at a central location, Rome, Geneva, London, New York, Stockholm. In contrast with the locals, there's a groupthink there because there's a social hierarchy as well as a political hierarchy where the sensibilities about how decisions are made follow something that's usually based in terms of social class, age, culture, gender, income, education, family connections, all of these kinds of situations. And as a result, there's very much an interest to maintain that kind of hierarchy. The other factor that I'll mention, so this is going beyond switching away from unconscious bias to another factor about balancing of interests, is the question of relationships. And so Christina had alluded to this, that part of what aid organizations rely upon, a lot of NGOs are looking for, is someone who has good connections, the right contacts. But this creates a sampling bias because you're ultimately working through the intermediaries' network of relationships and their contacts. It's not always clear that that is a comprehensive or representative sample, right? The other factor about relationships is that it creates an issue about what is the interests that are occurring. What is the nature of the reputation within those relationships? So Christina had mentioned reputation, but what I'll note is that there's a difference between the reputation that is observed or respected by the aid side, NGO side, the donor side, versus the reputation that's respected or expected by the local side. So with international aid and donors, it's always usually about, do you have the reputation as an intermediary of getting the job done? Right? Do you achieve the mission? Do you deliver on the deliverables? From the local side, the interest is your reputation as someone who shares the risks? Do you share the vulnerabilities of the locals? Are you someone who will not leave, right? Are you someone who understands the dangers that are inherent to what is going on? So that's the contrast between the two. So it's a very difficult balancing act. I can tell you that there are no easy answers for this kind of a situation. Ultimately, I think I do agree with Christina that this is very much a situation that involves sensitivity, and it helps tremendously to include people as part of the design process, not just simply the implementation process. The allegory that I would express, or perhaps it's an analogy, Rudyard Kipling, during his writings, had talked about the British East India Company, and that they had always feared young British men who would go off to Asia and go native, right? And so that's the actual term. Did this person go native? So the international NGO or the donors, they want intermediaries who are not native, who don't go native, whereas the locals very much do want someone who goes native, right? So that's the battle, and that's the difficulty that is inherent to the position of being intermediary. It's not always easy to resolve, I can tell you this. So someone like me, I have split personalities, and the way I behave and the way I talk differs depending if I'm with my family in Myanmar, if I'm visiting my sisters in Malmö in Sweden, if I'm visiting my friends in the United States, or if I'm working professionally here in Australia, my identity changes between all of those locations. So thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jonathan. Christina, do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for those excellent and wonderful comments. I'm very happy sort of to see the result of 8 years of work of being sort of questioned. What legal field are you studying if you're talking about the rule of law, and just constantly trying to explain the importance of these people. So I'm very happy to hear from individuals who have experiences of this type of work themselves, highlighting the importance of this. And I just wanted to say something quickly about what Jonathan just mentioned, and yeah, especially you could see that the program managers, the foreign program managers who had spent some time in Myanmar, they were aware, or more aware at least, of the local context and what was going on. And while they might have had the understanding of what needed to be done, it stopped at country level. So this knowledge would not then transfer back to headquarters, where, so that things would be amended or changed. It was often stopped at that level. And of course, being too much native was not seen as something positive, because you needed to understand how HQ functions and works, and how to fit into that model. And especially, and you also talked about the bias of choosing who's involved and who's invited in development when you work through these intermediaries. And that was a common comments I got from foreign practitioners, that we had no idea who was invited to our meeting or this training course, because the intermediary compiled a list of people, and we just don't know the landscape at all. So we don't know who is there at all. So I thought that was interesting, and something I commonly saw. So thanks again for the comments.
Fantastic, thanks, Christina. We have a few questions from the audience. We have one who has joined us today, who actually herself worked in Myanmar in 2015 and 2017 in the area of rule of law. And she comments that as I listen to you, I totally recognize the importance of intermediaries and the whole architecture you describe now, but never then. So very important research. And the importance is even more greater if we think of the complexity of the concept of rule of law in Myanmar, where for many it could be perceived as something very negative. I have many questions. And then she continues on with 2 questions, and I'll start with the first one. Do you think that intermediaries are in particular a particularly Myanmar development phenomena, Myanmar being very closed and then suddenly open to donors, or also visible in other development contexts? I know that Imelda, you also work mostly in the Philippines. Maybe you want to start to answer this question from your perspective.
I can.
Christina.
I have a short answer, and yeah. So no, it's definitely not a particularly Myanmar phenomenon. So, and that's the whole sort of basis for doing comparative work or work. You know, you draw on the context. So here I draw on the context of Myanmar, but I draw on experience from other writings about other contexts. And you know, the intermediary has existed since the colonial era, or even in other settings where you had a strong central power versus the regional headmen, etc. But especially with colonialism, you had the intermediaries and the headmen at the local level emerging to mediate the relationships. So in all established aid settings, we see these characters. I would say the difference in Myanmar is that because it is such a newly transitional setting, there were fewer intermediaries, especially when I did my study. So I was able to sort of study development as it was introduced, and it was easier to gain access to these individuals because the field hadn't sort of boomed as much as it had in a couple of years later. So that made it easier. And also, yes, because Myanmar had been so isolated and few people spoke local languages, etc., they were extra reliant on intermediaries. We also at that stage saw that most of them came maybe from an NGO to a political activist sector, while a couple of years later, you could see government officials leaving their positions to take on a role as consultants in a way that, if we look at Indonesia, probably happened a lot earlier, where you would see a broader category or group of intermediaries. And I'll leave it to Imelda if you want to contribute, but definitely not, you know, something you would find in most development settings.
Yeah, if I may add, I think in the context of where I work, that's in Mindanao, Philippines. So in a way, it's also quite a different context in the sense that, you know, we have the relationship with the central authority, Manila, and then the periphery, which is Mindanao, for example. So you have actually different layers of intermediaries there. Because it's necessary to navigate not only of course, the international development actors, but also you have here different authorities that have sometimes very different or competing interests, and that it requires actually, one, of course, is what has been mentioned, the trust. So that person actually has to have the trust, not only with, of course, the funding agency, but the trust in Mindanao and in Manila, in the central authorities and in Manila. Second, of course, is these are actually very specialist. In the beginning, of course, it was lawyers. You know, lawyers have these skills, not only knowledge of the law, but in the way they navigate different personalities and authorities that make them really, really very highly in demand. But I noticed right now, for example, in Mindanao, is that the intermediaries have become much more diverse. So they come from the civil society, but also IT professionals even, or other professionals. And that's because personal relationship is as much, you know, valued than probably the professional one. So you, in addition to the professional or technical expertise, you need to have that personal relationship. In fact, in my project there, it is my requirement actually, if you have sort of a personal relationship with someone there. And I think that's that's very common also in Myanmar, you know, on the lighter side. But you know, sometimes the personal relationship could also make or break. You know, sometimes it's not good to have that very close relationship, in the sense that you don't actually get the work done. You know, I mean, in terms of what, you know, what is the objectives of the program. But overall, I think really the work of the intermediary is really very fascinating, and I'm really glad that, you know, this book really is one of the few that really undertook a very, very critical look as well. So it's not all roses with respect to the intermediaries, because they also carry with them certain values and perspectives, and and they can be they can be supportive or actually in a position to what role of law programs are supposed to achieve.
Jonathan, do you want to add something to the question?
Sorry. No, it's mostly, I agree with both Imelda and Christina that, about the need for comparative study and, how the way things differ going across countries. But I will say, and I'll complement this to add to what both of them have said, that the position of the intermediary is going to be context specific, right? Because, the challenge, the gulf that needs to be bridged, the bridge that needs to be built between, the international versus the local is going to be different in each context. And so, there are going to be some places. And so what I think was specific to Myanmar, and this is where Myanmar, I think, is different from other countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, was that Myanmar was essentially the hermit kingdom of Southeast Asia, right? So it was closer to North Korea than it was to being another Thailand. And what I mean by that is you had a situation where Myanmar had an autarkic state, an autarkic economy, and suddenly in 2010, 2012, it reemerged and re-engaged with an international world. And that's what made things so different. And that's the reason why the divide and the division was so massive. And I think so many aid organizations just simply were not prepared to enter that space. And the other thing that did not help was that the locals were also not prepared to receive the international aid, because they had been taught for more than 70 years that foreigners were evil and foreigners were bad. And suddenly the foreigners were showing up. And they spoke a completely different language. And so, I told Christina this when I first met her, that one of the things that to me was shocking was that the last bunch of textbooks that were imported into the Myanmar universities were in the early 1970s. And what I told the aid organizations was, well, what was the state of gender studies in 1972? What was the state of feminist studies in 1972 compared to now? What was the state of human rights, free speech, minority rights in 1972 compared to now? And that's the level you're having to step back into time, and that's how far back you're having to step back.
And I should just add, because I study Myanmar as sort of a transitional example of an emerging donor setting. I don't think it wasn't until after the coup I understand how difficult the challenge was for these intermediaries. Like, it was hard to grasp how things were before transition, when you were in Yangon during these sort of optimistic, fun years when people were happy, they were optimistic about the future. And now again, of course, we see how brutal this military has been and is acting again. And that really sort of made me realize how difficult their situation, the intermediary situation, was in dealing with these actors. And you could see that especially, in relation to the national institutions and state counterparts in Naypyidaw, and sort of the fear that some intermediaries felt of going to official meetings, but also the confusion and sort of the official, the rituals around all these meetings and meeting counterparts and sort of the intermediaries. And I think for foreigners, especially understanding the strong sort of bureaucracy and how that worked in Myanmar under the sort of authoritarian conditions was a bit tricky.
Thank you. Let's take the second question from our audience, and it is as follows. Intermediaries are definitely a great asset and could be a part of a more locally driven development, but what, in your opinion, should be considered, including not ending up misusing the intermediaries and their networks, even putting intermediaries to danger? And should the use of intermediaries be somehow more transparent?
I mean, yeah, that is a very difficult question, and I think in sort of one key to recognizing their role is, stop talking about, the local staff and putting them, in their own section of an office, and then oppose that to the international experts, because a lot of these people felt that, I don't know what my role is, or actually they could have quite detailed explanations about the role, but then from the foreigner side, it was like, oh, it's just they're the local staff. So I think so it's sort of more equality in staffing, in salary. So you sort of recognize the skill set at play and how important it is to have both sides. I think that would be a start, at least from my perspective, but it's not an easy question, and of course it's important that these people remain sort of in their countries and that they build, and I mean they're also investing a lot in their own capital, and they often have ambitions that are beyond sort of the work of donors. So most of the people I met had political ambitions, and they were not necessarily seeing their work as they were not trying to fulfill the aims and goals of the donor. They use that platform to build their own capital. So the question is then, how do you better align those things so that you have people who in their own right, steers development, drives development, and they are development in a way, but how do you make that sustainable? And how do you bring their knowledge back into the design of projects? I think we need to start to recognize them as key and central actors and not local staff, quote unquote.
Jonathan or Mela, do you want to comment also?
I mean, I'm sure Imelda has something to say. We'll just have to try and encourage Imelda to add in. But so I'm somewhat of a postmodernist, so I always turn to Foucault. And to me, the process of creating an aid agenda and an implementation program, it's very much a knowledge production process, right? And we recognize that there's a power imbalance, there's a power structure. And so in my mind, and this is perhaps the sort of the theoretical basis for what Christina was just talking about, was that one of the ways that Foucault talks about resolving the power imbalance is to make sure that there is inclusion, but most importantly, equitable inclusion in the knowledge production process. So this means that with the locals, that it's not just that you're getting their comments, but they're actually involved in the decision-making. Right, so that they're providing information, but they're also involved in decision-making about the uses of that information, and then the outcomes of that information, which is that entire knowledge production process. Now, having said that, I do not imply or suggest that locals are beatific. They're not, you cannot say that locals are good and international foreign people are bad. That's not what I'm saying. But it's just as a matter of equity, and as a matter of like getting a more accurate picture, a more representative sample of information, that there is a need to have greater inclusion in the knowledge production process. So I'll just leave it at that. And then Imelda, I think, is going to have some things to add.
I think, yeah, the two of you have articulated already what I have in mind, and I've said, like, the intermediaries, the support staff, decisions are as important actually as the decision that the donors should have, on the project, and I think that's very like striking the balance as well. But how do you prioritize things? So I think that's the thing, like, because sometimes donors' expectations are set in stone. And although they say flexibility, they have these matrices actually in their files, right, that you need to fill in. And so it's really difficult, like, because, like, for example, when I work in Mindanao, it's hard to do that balance, because I am on one hand answerable to the donor, but at the same time I have to, that respect. I think that the element of respect really has to be there. And by respect, it's not just about, listening, but actually how you actually take that into consideration, their decision. So in fact, as an example, I have this debate on what the other day with my so-called coordinator, because she was saying that, so I was like, this idea about whether to formalize indigenous or traditional justice systems, and so it's a big debate really, whether, and my coordinator really has a strong opinion, on this matter. So of course listening, but also how you navigate those interests, is really very important, and you need to communicate this, and we need to communicate this to the donors, and the donors should really understand, the sentiments on the ground is really very important. And the intermediaries actually are the repository of the locals, so-called locals, knowledge and aspirations, and that must be listened to.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Imelda. Time runs quickly when you're having great discussions on interesting topics. Unfortunately, we have to end our webinar session with this. I want to thank you, Kristina, very much for your presentation, and also Jonathan and Imelda for your very insightful comments and reflections on the topic of intermediaries and rule of law and development assistance. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. And also thank you, Hedvig and Julia, who's been steering the technology from behind the scenes. And I hope the audience that you want to join us for our upcoming webinars, UI webinars. And I want to wish you all a great day. Bye.
Thank you so much.